extraterrestrial communication is true. What this instructs us is that there's extra dimensional things going on that we're not necessarily in touch with or aware of. And just because we're not aware of them or in touch with them doesn't mean they're not occurring. And so it really makes you wonder, are we really alone when we're alone with ourselves? Doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's actually a very good point, because a number of people, like, for example, Albert Bender and John Keel, felt, and actually Raven Mindell, a woman I interviewed for the book, pointed out that they all got the feeling that when they began delving into the UFO phenomenon, it was as if the phenomenon realized they were looking. It's like somebody, you look into something and the phenomenon realizes, and then it comes calling on you. And, that sort of ties in with what you're saying, that we're not necessarily alone when we think we are. It's almost as if, almost like a red light goes on when somebody starts looking into this, and the entities or the phenomenon itself then decide or realizes, hey, someone's looking for us, somebody's watching us, let's sort of turn the tables on them. And I think, that is what's happening. I think we're seeing evidence of that when you dabble in these types of phenomena, that they somehow then get their grips into you as well.
When you were shared about his interest in the King Arthur phenomenon, didn't you want to hear some of his findings after all those years of study?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he did open up to an extent. I mean, he essentially came to the conclusion that King Arthur was a very real person, but there was a lot of folklore, mythology, and just downright distortion of real stories, and turned into folk tales over the centuries, but that there had been a real King Arthur. And he felt that there was a tie-in, that possibly the ancients back, 1,000 years ago or more, may have known far more about these sort of portals and dimensions and gateways than we do today. We kind of pass it off as just stories. But back then, he felt that they knew far more about it, and that somehow the sort of the resting place of King Arthur, he came to believe, was in some other realm or portal or dimension, and that by opening these dimensions, you could essentially, if you weren't in control of the situation, sort of recklessly almost invite or invoke these sort of extra-dimensional entities into our realm of existence. And kind of like, in classic vampire mythology, the vampire can only enter your house when you invite it in. That's vampire mythology. And Perks kind of took a similar view, that opening the gateway to the domain of where King Arthur's final resting place would allow these things into our world, to our realm of existence, and then that they would sort of wreak havoc. And that was a story that essentially Sarah Key told to him as well. And he came to believe it, but the problem for Colin was that he just couldn't leave it alone. He just had to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And maybe that was to his cost eventually. I mean, we're forced to speculate, granted, but I mean, it is one of those sort of unsettling stories, which is, I often find myself just pondering on it. What really happened.
How old was he when he passed?
Oh, he was in his 60s, and as I point out in the book, I don't shy away from the fact the first time I met him, he chain smoked like a chimney. And he was a deeply stressed person. And I think largely as a result, like Albert Bender, he became obsessed by the phenomena, and the phenomena got its grips into him to such an extent that it became, every aspect of his life was almost controlled, by whatever this occult phenomena is. And I think, that's one of the problems that I sometimes see in these types of subjects, that people go from having an interest to having an obsession, and then it gets to the point of where every aspect of their life is controlled or perceived to be controlled by whatever's at the heart of the phenomenon, and it can cause sort of like a negative atmosphere in the home. I mean, a lot of the Men in Black witnesses I spoke to, for example, the MIB would turn up, they'd warn them not to talk about things, and then they'd leave. And then in the immediate aftermath, it was almost like, some paranormal entity said, right, I'm going to screw your life up for the next month. And they would have nothing but complete runs of bad luck, ill health, physical and mental, and psychological. Electrical equipment would malfunction. You know, it's like kind of like a constant Monday morning, you know, over and over again. Everybody gets those bad days when you get the bill you weren't expecting, the fridge stops working, you know, your car engine light comes on or whatever. We all get days like this. But it seems with Men in Black witnesses, in the immediate aftermath of the experiences, they're just pummeled by this sort of negative backlash. And that's what happened to Colin and Albert Bender. And, you know, I think we can learn a lot from these experiences. In other words, you know, we need to sort of walk with sort of a fair degree of trepidation when we're investigating these things.
But it hasn't stopped you.
Well, you know, I mean, from my perspective, you know, I'm one of these people who writes about UFOs, but I've never actually had a UFO experience. You know, I have a deep, profound interest in the phenomenon, but I guess in some respects, because I haven't had that life-changing experience, I'm also a bit of an outsider to the phenomena, reporting on it and looking inwards. And, you know, my view has always been that, you know, I balance my UFO research with a normal life. You know, me and my wife just do normal stuff. I do often find, and don't mean this from a negative perspective, but I do often find that people who particularly get involved in the MIB subject, you know, it becomes an obsession, and it becomes almost like an unhealthy obsession, particularly, you know, in years gone by, less so today. And I think it's important to sort of, one of the things I've found, and a number of researchers have suggested this, that the Men in Black seem to they're almost like psychic vampires, in the sense that perhaps part of their modus operandi, if you like, is to instill fear in the witness, and then they literally almost like feed. I mean, literally feed upon that high state of emotion, like an emotional vampire. You know, in legend, the vampire feeds on blood. The idea is with the Men in Black, they feed on high states of emotion. And a number of researchers have suggested, you know, the way to sort of rewire their working so they're not able to get their grips into you is to, you know, instill humor, or to have a life away from it, and it kind of lessens their ability to affect you. And, you know, some people may not agree with that. They might think it's too outlandish. But, you know, I think there is an aspect of this that the more you delve into it, the more the phenomena gets its grips into you, and very often from a profoundly negative aspect as well.
That's a very good point. Very perceptive. Have you found a particular country has more visitations or manifestations of this phenomenon, or there are certain countries that have a higher degree of reports?
Well, I mean, again, it's sort of difficult to answer, because I think a lot of it is dependent upon, number one, you know, the communication abilities in the relevant country. You know, for example, you look at the United States, we get a lot of reports of Men in Black from the US, from the UK, from Australia, from Canada, from mainland Europe, and, you know, we have good communication systems there. We get sort of less Men in Black reports, you know, from the jungles of South America or the plains of Africa. It may be that, you know, people see reports there, people see UFOs there, they're getting Men in Black experiences, but perhaps, you know, the lack of the internet or whatever, telephones in, you know, little villages where they're relatively poor, may actually have a bearing on the ability or not of people to report things. So I think it's hard to say what the frequency and distribution of reports is, but where there's good communication and, you know, etc., we get a lot of reports. And certainly in the 50s and the 60s, the United States was probably at the forefront, followed by Britain and Australia. Albert Bender's group had a significant following in Australia. There was like an Australian chapter of his group. And a number of the members there reported weird telephone interference and mail vanishing and letters being opened and tampered with in the mail before they arrived, and which caused some of those people to quit their Australian research as well. So, you know, I think it's a widespread phenomenon, but I think it's difficult to sort of actually get to the root of what the frequency of reports and how widespread they're being reported.
Who do the reports go to? Like, if somebody had an experience, let's say in California, who are they calling about it? Or where's the go-to place to